Senator Lee just had a wonderful exchange with a woman who is from the Independent Women's Law Center on the topic of sex and gender, but not specifically on the topic of transgenderism. He actually dug into an issue that goes back much further, and it goes a lot deeper. An issue where, if we want to really get at the heart of our present crazy sexual gender madness, which is dominating the headlines, it's all the libs want to talk about, and therefore the conservatives have to talk about it because it's upending society. That issue is before transgenderism, before redefining marriage, before all the crazy sexual revolution stuff. It goes all the way back to feminism and the feminist would-be constitutional amendment called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which would destroy women's rights in America. Senator Lee has recently dug into a recurrent, an almost perennial leftist issue. It's been cropping up since the 70s. And it's called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. This is the feminist constitutional amendment that, ironically, though not so ironically if you really understand feminism, but seems ironically, would destroy rights for women in America. And the ERA, the libs have been trying to ratify this thing for decades now. People don't actually want it, which is why it keeps stalling out. But Senator Lee asked Jennifer Braceras, who's at the Independent Women's Law Center, what the ERA really would look like in practice.
What might this do for sex-segregated prisons, prisons for women? What might this do for government-sponsored, government-funded, and operated shelters for abused women, for example, or public restrooms, locker rooms, athletic facilities, athletic competitions? What might strict scrutiny do to every one of those?
So in the racial context, courts have been very clear that prisons cannot separate inmates on the basis of race, even where doing so would prevent certain gang violence in the prison. And that's the right standard. They should not be able to separate inmates on the basis of race. If you applied that same standard to men and women, that would mean that prisons could never, they would have to have co-ed prisons. You could never separate inmates on the basis of sex, and male and female prisoners would have to be housed together.
That's right, ladies. We're going to bring you progress. We're going to liberate you women by forcing you to bunk up with big, gigantic Bubba over there when you're in prison. What could go wrong? Isn't that great? Isn't that progress? Reminds me of a line from Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball was asked during an interview, I think maybe with Dick Cavett many decades ago, what she thought about women's lib. And she said, I think I'm liberated enough. I think I could use a little less liberation. I don't think women's lib has made women very, very happy. And you can see this in study after study. Take studies of happiness with a grain of salt, but all of them seem to show that women have become much less happy since women's lib came about, both relative to men and in absolute terms. The ERA would do all sorts of other things, would effectively abolish women's bathrooms, though the transgender activists are trying to do that already, would effectively ban women's sports, would end women's schools, and all the special rights and spaces that women have specifically for themselves right now. How did this thing come about? Well, the ERA actually was not first proposed in the 70s. It came to prominence in the 70s. The ERA, though, was first proposed in 1923. This was the first version of it, written by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman, and it was introduced into Congress. Didn't get very far. Then there's another move to revive it in the 1970s. Congress set a ratification deadline of March 22nd, 1979. By 1977, the ERA had received 35 of the necessary 38 states to ratify it. So the feminists realized it wasn't going to work to get this thing through Congress. People didn't want it. But if they tried to surreptitiously go through all of the different states and get it ratified, they might, over time, push this thing through. So they were so close in 1977. They had 35 out of 38 states. And then along came not some man, some patriarchal, misogynistic man to put those women in their place. No, along came a little lady by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative woman, one of the most important conservative leaders in America, certainly of the 20th century, really, I would say, ever. She was a religious, mother of 6, I believe, and she rallied women around America, not the women that the feminists like, not the crazy hair, burning their bras, woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle kind of feminist ladies, but normal, regular women who love their husbands, who love their sons, who love their home life, who love their special privileges and places and rights and spaces in society, rallied those women around America and said, no, we don't want this progress that would destroy our role in society. At that point, 5 state legislatures, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, Tennessee, South Dakota, voted to revoke their ERA ratifications. So they'd already ratified it. They said, nope, we don't want this thing anymore. The first 4 rescinded their ratification before the original 1979 deadline. South Dakota did so by voting to sunset the ratification as of the original deadline. So the original deadline hits, okay, no more ERA because they couldn't get it through. In 1978, the libs kept it up. Congress passed by simple majorities in each house, and Jimmy Carter signed as president a joint resolution to extend the deadline, which is legally a little bit dubious, but they said, okay, we couldn't get the damn thing through. Well, all right, let's push it a few more years. 1982. And then guess what happened in those 3 years? No additional state legislatures ratified the ERA because nobody wants it because it's insane. Then in 2020, just 3 years ago, Virginia's General Assembly passed a ratification resolution for the ERA, which then claimed to bring that number up to 38. But of course, it didn't. There are so many reasons that obviously didn't work. They've blown through deadline after deadline. In order to claim that they had 38 states, they would have to ignore the fact that 5 state legislatures withdrew their ratification. It's just nonsense. But this is what the libs do. They just doggedly pursue their agenda, even if the people hate it, even if it's not particularly legal or constitutional. They're like a dog with a bone. They don't let go. That's why they generally win in the culture war stuff. The reason I mention this now is to be on the alert because they're going to keep pushing for this and we need to shoot it down. It would be terrible for women. It would be terrible for society. But also to point out that there's a line that some conservatives have used in recent years that is not true. They'll say, look, we hate second wave feminism. That's the bra burners of the 70s. That second wave feminism was bad. The third wave feminism, which was, I don't know, it was like the 90s, 2000s, that was also bad. And now I think we're in the 4th wave. I don't know, or the 50th wave, whatever wave we're in, that's also bad. But this is what they would say. They'll say the first wave feminists, they were really good. Those first wave feminists back in the 20s, they were the good ones. And it's not true. They're all the same people. They're all the same. Feminism is just bad, okay? It's bad because it posits, and this is the same issue that we see with transgenderism. It posits a false anthropology. It suggests that there is no meaningful difference between men and women. The traditional way of viewing men and women is that men and women are different. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Men and women go together. You're never going to have a war between the sexes because everybody's sleeping with the enemy. Men and women will never understand each other, but that's what adds spice to life, and we love that. And that's why men and women are coupled with one another. Human beings are a coupling species, and we come together, and by golly, we can procreate. Isn't that so amazing? It's only through the union of a man and a woman that we can actually partake of God's creation. Because what we can do without one another is we can, I can produce this show, and though I need a whole army of people to actually, make the show happen. But we can all do that. We can make a work of art. We can write a poem. We can bake a pie. But in order to partake of actual creation, not just putting stuff together and building it, but actually creating new life, you need men and women together. That's the old way of viewing things. The modern view, the feminist view, is that men and women don't need each other. They're basically the same anyway. It gets a little confusing because the feminists would argue that men and women certainly have the same brains, and their physical differences are just superficial. They only run skin deep. Whereas the transgenderists now claim that men and women have totally different brains, which is how men who think they're women, they actually allegedly have the brain of a woman or something like that, which irritates many of the feminists because the feminists say, who the hell are you to tell me that my brain isn't the same as a man's brain? And so they'll try to duke it out. But it all derives from the same false anthropology. Yes, the second wave feminists were bad. They're all bad, though, because it's all wrong. It's either true or false. It happens to be false, and we should oppose this stuff. This is going to be the topic of my speech in Buffalo. I'm giving a speech with Young America's Foundation up at the University of Buffalo on Thursday. Very, very excited for that. The topic that I have been requested to speak on is feminism. And, since I am the love guru here at the Daily Wire, Dr. Romance, I have many thoughts on this topic and thoughts on the topic of sex and gender in politics more broadly, because conservatives are always just fighting on the terms of the left. So now we're fighting over whether or not we should trans the 8-year-olds, if not the 9-year-olds. So we're fighting over whether we should abolish women's sports. No, we've got to go a little bit deeper. We've got to take on the feminists. The rest of the show continues now. You don't want to miss it. Become a member. Use code Knowles, KNWLES, at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans.